On 4 March 2026, an Iranian ballistic missile crossed into the airspace of a NATO country. Air defenses shot it down. But here's the twist that almost nobody is talking about. The real reason this moment is dangerous isn't just Iran, it's Turkey, the Kurds, a British air base under attack, and NATO trying desperately not to admit that it may already be sliding into this war. We're going to unpack the hidden fault line that could turn the Iran war into much bigger regional or maybe even global conflict. I'm Greg Allison. For decades, I worked in the world of engineering risk and hazard analysis, where one small failure can cascade into a system-wide disaster. But we're watching the Middle East right now, and it looks just exactly like that kind of a cascade because the headlines are focusing on missiles and drones. But the real danger lies in something deeper. The Kurdish fault line running through Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And the fault line is starting to crack open. Let's start with an event that brought this story into focus. On 4 March 2026, a ballistic missile fired during the ongoing Iran war crossed into Turkish airspace. Air defenses linked to NATO intercepted the missile before it could impact. Debris fell near Hatay province, not far from the Syrian border. That may sound like it's just another war headline, but this is strategically enormous because Turkey isn't another country, just another country. It's a NATO member. Turkey is a NATO member, which means a missile crossing into its territory raises the question of Article 5, NATO clause that treats an attack on one member as an attack on all. Now, NATO leaders quickly tried to calm things down. On 5 March 2028, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated that Article 5 was not under consideration. Translation: the alliance intercepted the missile, but nobody wants to admit what that implies. Now let's zoom out one more step, because just days before that missile incident, something else happened. On 3 March 2026, a drone believed to have been launched by Hezbollah struck near the RAF Akrotiri base there in Cyprus. Now, forgive me if I get a few pronunciations off, but I'm trying my best here. The RAF Akrotiri isn't just a base, it is sovereign British territory, which means the strike effectively hit territory of a NATO nuclear power. Not to mention that Cyprus is divided between Greece and Turkey, both of them NATO nations, but this was British sovereign territory. The damage was limited. No major casualties occurred. So Britain and NATO chose containment instead of escalation. But think about the pattern we now have. March 3rd, Hezbollah-linked drone hits British sovereign territory in Cyprus. March 4th, a ballistic missile linked to Iran, launched from Iran, crossed into Turkish airspace. This is two separate incidences involving NATO territory within 48 hours. The war is already touching the alliance. The only reason NATO isn't fully involved yet is because leaders are trying very hard to keep it that way. Here's one part that most news coverages miss. Turkey is not just a NATO member. Turkey has one of the largest militaries in the alliance, roughly 400,000 active personnel, hundreds of thousands more reserves, large mechanized ground forces, large drone capabilities, and a powerful air force. Turkey also shares direct land border with Iran. If Turkey enters the war directly, this stops being a missile exchange. It becomes a major conventional ground war. And that brings us to the real geopolitical twist. Right now, there is one force that could actually put serious ground pressure on the Iranian regime: the Kurds. There are Kurdish militant and opposition ground forces, ground groups along Iran's western border. Some of these groups have long opposed the Iranian regime. During protests earlier this year, Iranian Kurdish regions were among the most volatile. And reports surfaced on 6 March 2026 that Kurdish opposition groups were considering attacking Iranian security forces from bases in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. From a purely military standpoint, that could put serious pressure on Tehran, because insurgencies on Iran's western frontier could stretch the regime's security forces. But there's a problem, a big one. Turkey has its own Kurdish insurgency history, and Turkey fears that Kurdish militants gaining momentum in Iran could ignite unrest among Kurdish inside of Turkey. And that's why Ankara is watching groups like the PJAK, an Iranian Kurdish militant organization. For Erdogan, the worst case scenario is not just Iran becoming unstable. The worst case is a chain reaction of Kurdish uprisings across the region: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. That's a geopolitical earthquake running across the entire Middle East, which is why Turkey may actually oppose the very ground forces that could destabilize Iran's regime. And that's where things get even more interesting. Yes, on 7 March 2026, reports emerged that Donald Trump asked the Kurdish forces to stay out of the war. At first glance, this sounds strange, because if your goal is to weaken Iran's theocratic government, Kurdish insurgents might seem like a useful pressure point. Wow, they might even be able to arm the protesters who were mowed down by the IRGC. But once you factor in Turkey, the picture changes. Encouraging Kurdish militancy could destabilize a NATO ally sitting directly on Iran's border. So Washington suddenly has to balance two competing goals: pressure Iran, but avoid triggering a Kurdish regional insurgency that could fracture NATO politics. Personally, I think that people should have the right of self-determination. I've said that on here for a long time. The Kurds should have their own country. But the geopolitics of the day just don't support that. Well, at least not just yet. So now, add the Eastern Mediterranean to the map. On March 3rd, drone strikes on the RAF Akrotiri base forced Britain to reinforce defenses around Cyprus. Well, the UK wasn't quite yet up to it. They had to call on the French to defend their base. France and Greece have also strengthened security measures there. And for good reason, because meanwhile, Turkey is reportedly considered deploying F-16 aircraft to northern Cyprus. Cyprus just happens to be a major point of military contention between two NATO nations, Turkey and Greece. So now, the regional map looks like this: Iran fighting Israel and U.S. forces, missiles flying toward Turkey, Iranian proxies hitting British territory in Cyprus, Turkey worried about Kurdish insurgency spreading across the borders. This is no single conflict. There is a regional system under stress. History shows that wars rarely expand in one dramatic moment. Instead, they grow through a series of limited steps: one missile, one drone strike, one proxy militia, one defensive interception. Each action looks contained, but the map slowly fills with new actions. Right now, we're seeing exactly that pattern. Iran, Israel, United States, Hezbollah, Turkey, Kurdish militias, Britain, NATO. Every week, the network gets bigger. Not to mention the Gulf states all around south of Iran. For those of us that watch global events through a preparedness lens, here are the signals that you need to watch out. Here's what you need to monitor. First, watch for additional missile or drone incidents involving NATO territory. Second, watch the Kurdish regions of Iran and Iraq. If insurgency activity increases there, the strategic map changes dramatically. Third, watch Turkey, because Turkey sits at the intersection of almost every fault line of this war. If Ankara decides it must act to protect its borders and internal stability, this conflict could expand quickly. So here's the big takeaway. Most of the dangerous expansion path is in this Iran war may not even be Israel or even the United States. It may be this hidden geopolitical collision. Iran's regime fighting for its survival. Kurdish insurgencies pressing from the West. They may not accept Trump's stand-down request. Turkey fearing those insurgencies spreading across its border, and NATO already intercepting missiles and absorbing drone strikes. That's the kind of unstable strategic geometry that has turned regional wars into global ones before. So the question just isn't, will Turkey fry Iran? The bigger question might be, what happens if the Kurdish fault line fractures the entire region first? So there's a lot at play here, and it's multidimensional. A lot of forces are coming to this, and as yet, we don't know exactly where it's going to go. But I'm going to come on here and try to bring you this and bring you analysis often not heard on any other channel, like this analysis I just brought to you, about where this can be going. Because we are living in perilous times, and if you're not paying attention, then all I can say is God help you. Seriously, you better hope, prep, and pray. With that, watch my channel for future updates, because this war is just on the verge of becoming interesting. So always keep your eyes wide open and head on the swivel, because I am worried that some of this stuff could come home. If nothing else, the economics of it are hitting us in the pocketbook right now with increased gas prices, which could cascade into other escalating costs, and Lord only knows what else. With that, I'm going to say thank you for watching. Another video right here to see, and Greg out.